Evening, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm a little bit early, so we'll let everyone else join us, but welcome to those that are already here. Tonight's is ethics, ready for tomorrow afternoon's exam. So if you want to start posting any questions, I can start having a read and get a feel for what it is that you would like to go over. Mainly just things about how to handle tomorrow's exam. So yeah, please feel free to start typing any comments that you've got, any questions that you've got, and we'll get cracking on 6 o'clock. I hope your revision this week has gone really, really well and that you're feeling confident about tomorrow's exam. Oh, good. I'm really pleased I was able to help for philosophy. Thanks, everyone. I'll do my very best to answer your questions once we get going. Thank you for your questions so far. Hopefully, you found philosophy manageable. Obviously, we did predict the verification of via negativa that I thought that would be there, and that at least it was the general area of problem of evil. I thought John Hick would have been specified, but at least if you'd done the John Hick natural evil would have been manageable. And of course, what was the other question? It's only been a week, and I've already forgotten about philosophy. Philosophy, what's that? The daycare one was obviously the more challenging one, especially if you hadn't have gone over daycare. And can't even remember what the other question was on. So there you go. Oh, William James's approach to religious experience. So overall, I thought they were very kind to you. It was one of the nicer papers I've seen in a long while. So I thought the paper was quite kind. They can sometimes ask some pretty mean questions. Certainly, the year before's question on Anselm's four-dimensionist approach to nature of God. I think that one will go down in history as quite a awful question. Right, let's get going then. I will go back up to the top. Um, So the idea for natural law of whether humans can have an inclination towards good, you still talk about all of natural law. So how we're inclined towards good through God-given gift of reason, and then we apply. You can talk about synderesis. You can talk about the overlaps with conscience, like rector ratio. So using right reason, how sometimes you can get it incorrect, like apparent and real goods, or you might want to talk about invincible ignorance, and do an overlap there to conscience. That's absolutely fine. But then you would still link that approach in for that inclination towards good, towards therefore following the primary precepts, etc. So thank you for that one. Um, Conscience question, it purely depends on what the conscience question actually is. For a question on meta ethics, is it valid to recruit H.A. Pritchard? No. He does help, obviously, within the specific area, but the extra names are absolutely essential, or the extra developments are absolutely essential. But certainly, it's good to know it just to plump out an essay. So Pritchard is good for a plump, but it's not necessary. Compare Aquinas and Freud for conscience. It came on last year, so I very much doubt you will get another question for Aquinas and Freud this year on conscience. If it's going to be on conscience, I don't think it will be, but if it is, it probably might be around something to do with guilt, or it might just be a very general question on conscience. So just being able to talk about the different approaches is what would work there for conscience. Do I think meta will come up? Yes, I think meta ethics will come up. The examiners like asking meta ethics questions, and because you've only got 3 topics in the second year, they're going to have to ask you something from the second year. So I think sex ethics and meta are going to be there. That's what I would say. How do you structure a business ethics essay? Again, it purely depends on what the questions are that's being asked. If it's specific on business, keep to your themes. Your themes are what help you structure a business essay. So by themes, I mean things like corporate social responsibility, globalization, shareholders, stakeholders, the use of sweatshops, the use of, the ethics, the different names, Friedman and Laura Sugar and people like that. So that's how you structure a business ethics essay. But again, it purely depends on what the question is specifically as to how you would structure it more clearly. What points would you make for globalization? If you get a question in business ethics that's specific on a theme, still link globalization to the other themes. So still talk about corporate responsibility in globalization. So globalization is a business going global. That's all it means. And so again, you talk about the responsibility they have to the country that they are in. You talk about why do they go to other countries? Is it because they go to other countries to get cheap labor and therefore leading to the sweatshop discussion, or the idea of whistleblowing, like what they've looked at inside the Apple factories and what's been happening with the suicide nets. And so with globalization, you would still discuss all of your themes, but you would link it to the idea of if a business has gone global, that's good for the business. It's great for money because there's more properties for people to buy things, more access to it, but then the ethics might be questionable, which is what you would then discuss. And of course, with business ethics, you can bring in a bit of Kant or a bit of utilitarianism just to develop your argument. The one about briefly explain prescriptivism. Prescriptivism is old spec. You don't need to know prescriptivism for metaethics. Metaethics is purely ethical naturalism, intuitionism, and emotivism. Prescriptivism used to be on the old spec. So if you haven't learned prescriptivism, do not worry. You're not meant to have done. If you have done it, then it's good for extra learning and extra discussion within an essay. But if it's confusing you, you don't need to know it. So yes, it's not as necessary, isn't prescriptivism. I like Emma. That's a really good question. The idea of can you criticise emotivism with emotivism itself and using A as arguments against him? Yes, that's fine. Obviously, he said he's not arguing that emotivism actually makes it meaningful. He's just explaining why it's not cognitive, why it's not like ethical naturalism or intuitionism, why emotivism is just somebody's emotive view, and therefore it, your emotional view is no higher value than my emotional view. Hence why he says you just need to agree to disagree, sort of thing. So you could use verification though to develop your argument. Now that would be clever. That would be nice. How would you write an essay on the 4 working principles and 6 propositions? Now, I doubt you will get a question that's specific tomorrow, but it is on the spec and it's never been asked before. So therefore, you need to be prepared. Situation ethics has never been asked in the second year before. It's been asked in the first year, it's been asked in the first year for the AS this year, but it's never been specifically asked in the second year. So it means that it might be on the second year paper. If it is, how I've advised my students to do is to merge the 6 and the 4. If you just do an essay of going through all the 6 and then all the 4, oh, God, it'd be boring for you to write it, it'd be boring for your examiner to read it. I would merge some of them because some of the 4 link in very closely to quite a few of the 6. So I would link in one of your 4 to a couple of your 6 and then discuss them, apply them to euthanasia or whatever it might be, or sex ethics if that's what it's within. But I would merge them to cover your six, and you don't have to go through all of them in great evaluative detail. You can just mention a couple, but then explore more in more detail. But I would make sure if it does ask specifically for the six and the four, that you show that you at least know what they all are. Thank you for that question, Scarlett. That's a good question. Euthanasia, I think, is quite a possibility with situation ethics. I don't think euthanasia would be asked on its own. Conscience, I don't think will come up again, but it might do. Yeah, intuitionism argues that ethical statements are objective. At times, it might look like it argues for the alternative. That's evaluation. That's where you can say, hang on a minute, though, if you're arguing it's objective, it's cognitive, then how can this be applied? So, actually, that's part of your discussion. So, that's a good thing that you've noticed that. Thank you, Charlie, for that one. How do you bring in other ethical theories when the question doesn't ask for them? I'm guessing you mean that if it's a euthanasia, a business, or a sex ethics. Now, sex ethics might say no theory is useful when dealing with issues surrounding sex ethics. That's a common question they ask. And in that case, I would bring in two arguments. I'd bring in an argument that you think works, an argument you think doesn't work, and say why one works for sex ethics themes. So only homosexuality, extramarital or premarital, and why the other one doesn't. But you do it as a compare question. I think shows more technique than chunking it. But if it gives you freedom over the choice, then I'd always stick with two theories, because then you get more depth of discussion. If it's a business ethics essay, something like corporate response, corporate social responsibility leads to window dressing, or whatever that question was that I wrote on the predictions PowerPoint. Hypocritical window dressing. Basically, it means we're all front and we don't practice it. That's what that question is asking for. You don't have to bring in Kant and utilitarianism in there. If it doesn't ask you for a specific theory, you don't have to bring in a theory. You can if you want to, though. But certainly in sex ethics, it normally implies it in the question. So the questions will be quite clear as to whether they want you to bring in a theory or not. If you still want to bring one in, you can do. Just make sure you always keep it to the question. Thank you for all your questions so far. Thank you, Max, for that one. How should you write about the specific details? How much should you write about the specific details, things like four working principles and three postulates? It depends if it's actually asked in the question. If it's actually part of the question, then you have to do them in detail. The postulates are specified on the specification, meaning that they could ask you a specific question on the postulates. Again, I doubt it. If it's not in the question, then you can just mention them as part of your argument if it's relevant. If you miss off the postulates in a general Kant question, you aren't going to lose marks. But if it works for your argument and works for the question, then bring them in. If it's the question, then you have to talk about them in detail. If it's not in the question, you just want to add them in, you can add them in quite briefly. But again, don't just content dump. Don't dump things in any essay that you don't make relevant to your line of argument and the question. How do you apply evaluation without diverging from the question? Thank you, Cal, for that one. You shouldn't never divert from the question, because the question should always, so for Kant and Kant on sex, for example, you should have a clear line of argument whether Kant is helpful, useful, whatever critical word you want to use, unless it's actually in the question. But you should always have an argument throughout anyway. So if it's Kant and sex, you're working through Kant's duty, goodwill, means to an end. You're linking it across to sex, homosexuality, premarital, whatever it is you decide. But you should be evaluating throughout, and it should never go off the question, because the question itself wants you to evaluate them. So your line of argument should be clear throughout whether it does or does not work in application to sex ethics, because that's what the question is asking. So your evaluation shouldn't go off the question if your line of argument is clear. Sorry, I just lost my space with the questions there. Let me see if I can, so I don't want to miss people's questions. How do you avoid waffling in your essays? Just make sure that you keep your themes clear. You shouldn't. DCT next week is probably when you will waffle more, because you're trying to make arguments from not a lot of content in some cases. Whereas with ethics, you tend to not waffle that much because you're juggling you're always going to be juggling a number of things. You're going to be juggling a theory with potentially an application. You've only got 40 minutes, so to avoid waffling, just keep your themes and your line of argument really clear, and you should avoid bringing in things that then are not relevant. How would you go answering a question of act versus rule? So tell us a very good question. Do not forget that if it's an act versus rule, they don't just want you to talk about act versus rule. They want you to talk about Bentham versus Mill. That's just a way of saying Bentham versus Mill, because Bentham is an act utilitarian, the act of always using the hedonic calculus in every given situation. Rule means you apply the rules to maximize happiness, but sometimes you need to change those rules in extreme situations. So you are a weak rule. So how you do it is, if it's a compare, you would work through. So you would look at how just a general one of just the act approach of every individual situation is looked at, whereas versus a rule applied to all, which approach is better than the act of applying hedonic calculus, whether that's helpful or not, with the act of trying to maximize, the principle of utility from Mill and the happiness of everyone. So that's how you would structure that. So whilst it's very narrow as act versus rule, it still wants you to pretty much compare all of Bentham and Mill. That's what that's asking. I wouldn't bring in all four areas into a question. If you mean the theories, I would avoid bringing in four theories for sex ethics. Why? Because you only got 40 minutes. That gives you just over 10 minutes a piece to talk about each of the different theories. That would be, when you think about how many slides, there's about 20 slides per theory, and then there's another 20 slides for sex. How are you going to be able to cover all that with evaluation? You aren't. I'd say that covering four is very ambitious, and it just means that you'll be very vague rather than go in depth. Bible quotes, fabulous. If they link to line of argument in the question, use Bible quotes. That's brilliant. Ethical naturalism has never been asked before, Sam. So meta ethics, I think, might be focused on ethical naturalism. Whether what is meant by the word good is the divinity question in the study of ethics, and meta ethics. Yeah, they could ask you that question. It just means that is it can you understand the meaning of the word good in ethics? So again, I would probably use two theories rather than try and get all three in. I would say which argument actually works to understand good, because don't forget that all arguments in meta-ethics disagree. So emotivism disagrees with the other two, intuitionism disagrees with ethical naturalism, so they all disagree. So I'd pick two, one that actually maybe does help us understand the meaning of good and one that doesn't, and use them against each other. If you were asked about situations, could you counter it with values from another theory? If it's euthanasia you're talking about, only counter it with natural law. Natural law and situation ethics go with euthanasia. Kant and utilitarianism go with business. Do not cross-correlate, cross-pollinate any, do not overlap the theories. So if you do want to develop your situation ethics more, and you're linking situation ethics to euthanasia, so it's not a situation ethics and sex question. If it's situation ethics and sex question, you can bring in any theory you want. If it's a situation ethics and euthanasia, then link it to natural law if you want to, but just make sure that you answer the question and you don't go into long depth and detail about another theory that's not relevant. It's only evaluatively. If it's a vague question, you lose marks for not applying it if you're meant to. You will know if you're meant to apply it or not. If they say the words moral decision making, normally that's the phrase they use. Look at the past questions on the PowerPoint and you'll see the phrasing. And if they say moral decision making, I'm trying to think if they use ethical decisions, they might use, but that means, they want you to apply it to an actual decision making. How does it help you make a decision about euthanasia, for example? So if you didn't, you won't lose marks. But again, it'll if it asks for act versus rule, as we've already discussed, then that's very clear. It just wants you to talk about those and not business. If it asks about Kant's duty, that's just Kant's duty. If it says Kant's duty as applied to ethical decision making, that means Kant's duty with business. If assess the view that good has meaning, how many theories? Again, I'd do two. You could do all three, but I think for depth in 40 minutes, do two and compare which one is better, worse. You don't have to do a religious one versus a secular one if you get an option in a sex ethics question. If it helps you to discuss them in more depth or detail, if you want to do a secular versus a religious one, brilliant. If it gives you more to talk about, but you don't have to. In a sex ethics, you can pick any of the four. Internal, external acts in corporate social responsibility, absolutely. Alex, you can talk about them. Do you need to know all six propositions? It's a risk if they do ask a specific question on the six. So you normally, I would say you don't need to know all the six, but like you don't need to know like all the hydraulic calculus. You just need to know a few. But if they did ask you a specific question on the six propositions, you would need to show knowledge of the six. Good examples for euthanasia. I'm not sure what you mean with good examples. If you've got an essay just on ethical naturalism, I would explore ethical naturalism from F.H. Bradley on its own first and evaluate it. I'd look at Philippa Foot and then evaluate that approach, what they're trying to actually say about how you understand the meaning of good, bad, right, and wrong. And then you could compare it to another theory that you might think is better or worse, or you could just bring in G.E. Moore or Hume, because both criticize ethical naturalism, the years or argument. So that would create at least three paragraphs. If you did bring another theory for comparison, like intuitionism or emotivism, to say why ethical naturalism does or doesn't work, make sure ethical naturalism is always your focus. Do not start a paragraph with intuitionism or emotivism. Don't get bogged down in content. You are simply mentioning intuitionism and a point brief to say why it's better or worse than ethical naturalism. Same with emotivism. Yes, absolutely. You could say how you can condemn natural law because we're very, don't forget, you're not, when it comes to things like sex ethics, you're not arguing whether the theory is right or wrong in the decision it makes. You're arguing whether it's useful or not in helping you make that decision. So, can you easily apply natural law to understanding it? Even if the answer you don't like the answer, doesn't mean the theory is not useful. But then you could then explore that actually natural law tends to, not in all cases, and again, that's the discussion you would have, but natural law tends to lean against homosexuality. But therefore, because as a society we've progressed a lot further, certainly in the UK anyway, we've progressed a lot further towards an inclusive society and have much more understanding now that actually a lot of Aquinas doesn't work in reality. So it helps you understand what the answer would be ethically, but it isn't easy to then apply it within our society. That would work nicely. Do I think Kant's likely? I don't think Kant has ever been asked for sex ethics. I think he's the only one that's never been asked. All the others have been asked specifically for sex ethics. I might be wrong, but again, it'll be on the predictions PowerPoint. No, if you don't remember the scholars' names, it's not the end of the world. Remembering their arguments helps. If you can remember their name, brilliant. If you put the wrong name, you don't get lose marks. So sometimes it's worth just having a stab in the dark if you don't know the right name. But certainly the argument is what. So the argument and then evaluating if the argument is valuable or not. that gets you more marks. So if you can't remember a name, don't then leave off the argument, put the argument in there anyway. Yes, especially if you don't. But easy way to do it is just some quick flashcards tonight of names with the points and see if you can quickly remember them. Preference utilitarianism again is old spec, it's Singer. It's a really good part of utilitarianism, but you do not have to learn preference utilitarianism. You only need to learn Bentham and Mill. If you've learned preference again, it's more wider reading. You do not need to know preference utilitarianism. Emotivism, intuitionism, been asked before. Yes, but again, check the past questions PowerPoint because they're all there specifically what years they've been asked. Link 3 categorical imperatives to business ethics. So that's your 3 arguments from Kant. So universalizability, means to an end, and kingdom of ends. So you just apply them across to different themes within business ethics. Kingdom of ends, the means to end and kingdom of ends are just extensions of universalizability. The first formulation is the key. Kingdom of ends is very much like means to an end. Means to an end is don't use people, but kingdom of ends is everybody as an end in themselves has value and worth. So they're very close together, a means to an end and kingdom of ends, and they're part of universalizability. So they're extensions of universalizability rather than separate theories, according to Kant. But I doubt you get a specific question on the 3 formulations in application to business. No, James, sorry, I just read your comment there. You use flew instead of a as that name. Absolutely fine. No, you will not be marked down. Your essay will not sink if you've put in the wrong name. I always give the example to my students of an essay a number of years ago, and I was marking for the exam board, and the student wrote Aristotle all the way through their essay instead of Aquinas, and they were talking about cosmological argument, and they used Aristotle all the way through. The arguments were still superb. The student had just brain flopped and put the wrong name throughout their essay, and they still did extremely well because the arguments there. The examiners understand and appreciate you are very, very stressed out. You're under high amounts of pressure. So no, your essay will not sink because you used the wrong name. So that's fine, James. So how you would lay out a general sex ethics question, I'm guessing if you get to pick your own theories, that's what you mean. So I would pick 2 theories. So I would pick a theory I like and a theory I don't like. So I quite like Kant. I know people will disagree. Don't throw cabbages at me. I quite like Kant's argument. Why? Because it's straightforward. It's 3, 3, and 3. Duty, goodwill, moral law, 3 formulations of the categorical imperative, and the 3 postulates. So it's an easy one to remember. And so I find utilitarianism not always the easiest one to apply because I find it vague. Pleasure doesn't necessarily lead you to the right ethical decision because it's an instantaneous thing. So I find utilitarianism doesn't always work. So if it was a sex ethics, I would pick Kant versus utilitarianism. So then all I would do is I'd pick 1 theme for Kant, duty, 1 theme for utilitarianism, hedonic calculus, and then I would have a theme in the middle, like homosexuality, and I'd apply them to that theme to say why one argument is more useful than the other. And then in the next paragraph, I'd do a different theme from each and a different issue surrounding sex ethics. So that's how I would structure it. How likely is euthanasia to come up? Not likely on its own. It might be for situation ethics. They might ask for situation ethics with it. What theories could you link to hypocritical window dressing? So if you get a corporate social responsibility, you would discuss corporate social responsibility. You'd talk about the ethics within business and whether they are actually practicing what they preach or whether it is just a window dressing to make them look good. But if you want to bring in a theory, it's Kant or utilitarianism, and or you could bring both in. But again, you don't have to bring in a lot of content from them. Alice, just Google it. It'll be on. Just search it in YouTube. It'll be there. The 3 postulates. So the 3 postulates are autonomy, that we have to be free. We have to be free to follow our duty. We have to be free to follow universalizability. Otherwise, we can't be judged properly. The next one is then if you follow your duty with goodwill, freely wanting to be a good person, then there has to be a reward. You have to be rewarded for this behavior. And so, therefore, you must be immortal because this world is wicked and horrible and you can't achieve it in this life. So, therefore, there must be a world where you can achieve your reward for being a good person because you want to be good, not because you want that reward. And so, therefore, the second postulate is there must be immortality, an immortal soul, an afterlife. And therefore, to ensure there is an afterlife where you are rewarded, there has to be a God to ensure it. So, there are your three postulates. Do you have to speak about theories if the question doesn't mention any? So if it's a general business ethics question like the corporate social responsibility, you don't have to if you don't want to. If you've got plenty to argue and write about, you don't have to mention them. If it's on homosexual, like one thing to be aware of with the sex ethics questions is there's never been a specific question asked on a specific area of sex ethics. So there's never been a question specifically on homosexuality or one. So it might say no theory is useful when dealing with issues surrounding homosexuality. They might actually specify the theme in sex. And so therefore, I would really struggle to not bring in a theory and just discuss the ethics surrounding homosexuality. So I think that even if they don't ask for a theory, it depends on whether you have enough of a discussion. I could talk about corporate social responsibility all day. I could talk about how that links to whistleblowing and different countries and different laws and sweatshops and Apple and different companies. But if it came to something as specific as homosexuality, I'd need the support of utilitarianism or Kant or something to answer that one. Also, I advise you to, for case studies and things, make sure you know enough to be able to talk about any of those sex themes in detail. So know what countries homosexuality is illegal. Know what countries you get capital punishment if you are a homosexual. Have a look at the legal age range for sex, so that or countries that marry you off young and things like that, so there won't be premarital sex. But is that any better than us not having the culture of not marrying and therefore we're having premarital sex? Because don't forget, premarital sex, you assume it's only like teenagers, promiscuous teenagers having lots of sex. Actually, premarital sex is just anybody that doesn't get married. They're all having premarital sex. But actually, is that better than marrying an 11-year-old off in a certain country? But you have to know the countries to then have that discussion. So some of you might need to do a little bit of research into examples, look at the BBC News, get some examples that you can talk about. Again, have a look at the PowerPoint for the 2022 questions. How would you structure an essay that links two topics? So do you just mean the application process? Do you just mean how you would link natural law to euthanasia, for example, or how you would link Kant? So if that's the question and that's what you're asking and what you mean, with something like that, you would work through briefly the theme that you're talking about. So the first primary precept of preservation of life, why preservation is important. You would then link it over to part of whatever the application is. So don't link about the whole of euthanasia. Think about maybe sanctity of life and whether it helps understand sanctity of life or not, and then evaluate it. So you're just juggling more things together, but the paragraph should follow some sort of consistency of outline your theme, link it, evaluate, or outline theme, even brief evaluation, then link, then more evaluation. If a question was on Kant, there's a really nice question there, Alexa. If the question was on Kant, oh, my Alexa's going to come to life. If you've got a question specifically on that, what I would say is, let me read you.
I don't know that.
Alexa, shush. If you've got a question specifically on that, I would say if it mentions Kant in the question, then you need to keep Kant as your structure. So I would theme it with Kant's argument and then link it to sex ethics. I wouldn't structure it with your sex ethics themes and then link it to Kant. I think it's easier if, how I always say to my students as well, is your structure of your essay is what the question asks for. So if your question says Kant's approach to sex ethics, that's the structure of your paragraphs. Kant's approach to sex ethics. That's how you structure it in an essay. So whichever name comes first is the structure, and then whatever comes second in the question is who comes second in the paragraph. If we get just a Kant question, do we add in euthanasia? No, absolutely not. Kant and euthanasia, definitely not. You cannot link Kant to euthanasia. It's only natural law, situation ethics to euthanasia, Kant, utilitarianism to business. You do not link utilitarianism or Kant to euthanasia, like you do not mention natural law and situation ethics to business. It's not the end of the world, but the examiners don't ask for it. On the specification, they keep it very separate and very clear. So it's more that you're not following what the examiners have asked for you to do. So it's very important to keep them separate. Yes, teleological in as a criticism of naturalism. Casey, that sounds really, really good. Cassie, that sounds really, really good. So yes, definitely. Um, The four working principles, there's nothing really other than just memorizing them. There's nothing particularly there's nothing hidden, there's no hidden meaning there. It is literally just the name of them and what that name means. So check out the teach along and then let me know, Lois, if you're still struggling with a comment afterwards, and I'll try and find a different way of explaining them. But it's basically just don't overcomplicate ethics. It's just literally what the name is and what that name means. That's all they need you to know. There was another situation ethics question as well. How would you evaluate the six? If you got one on the six propositions, or how would you evaluate situation ethics as a whole, or the six and the four? You would just work through whether they actually help you understand an ethical dilemma or situation. If it doesn't ask you to apply it to euthanasia, then you could just argue generally, do you think situation ethics works or doesn't work? I don't think situation ethics works. My students know I'm not a fan of situation ethics. I'm not a fan of the six and the four because I find them quite vague, repetitious. I don't understand how to actually apply them. So I would just evaluate what they are saying and whether you actually think they work or not. So the idea of love and justice, well, what does that actually mean? Or another one is about looking to the good in your neighbor and things. Is that actually, can you actually apply that? What happens if your neighbor doesn't apply agape? So I would just evaluate them based on, do you think they have merit or not? Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine, Lois. Yeah, no, don't worry. The over analyzing works very well for philosophy, but in ethics, it normally is. Ethics is very, very straightforward, everyone. So in ethics, the content actually is quite simple. This exam tomorrow is testing your exam technique. It's testing your essay technique rather than content, because actually there's not a lot of content, and the content is fairly straightforward. There's no argument that is particularly, not like philosophy. There's no nature of God in these arguments. There's nothing that's really, really philosophically tricky. It's more about how you write about them in an essay that's hard. Harm principle. Oh, very, very good question, Chloe. Is the harm principle for Mill or Bentham? Ooh, I think that might be both. I actually do not know that one. You've asked me a question I don't know. I would definitely say it sounds like Mill, because Mill talks about autonomy, talks about consent, and he's very, very passionate about free will. But then Bentham also doesn't, he argues that you can't, even though the minority might be ignored, the minority is still very important. So he wouldn't justify things like sweatshops and stuff, and so that would apply the harm principle. So I think that both of them link in. But that's a very good question. That's a very good question. Is that one might be a bit of a Google. Oh, harm principle is Mill. Thank you, it's Mill. Yep. Oh, fabulous, everyone. Well done. Oh, that'd be brilliant if you did about Mill in politics. That would be very interesting, I imagine. Struggle how to get a full paragraph on one of the meta ethics. Check out the teach along, because there's still at least 3 slides for each of the theories. And by the time you've worked through all the different names, approaches, and evaluated them, don't forget, usually on my teach alongs, if it's a PowerPoint slide, that's kind of aimed at a paragraph, because all I cover on my PowerPoint slides is content. It's not discussion, evaluation, line of argument, links to the question. So by the time you've gone through kind of one of the slides and you've evaluated and you've linked the question, that would be a full paragraph. And don't think about your paragraphs having to be massive. You can do shorter paragraphs, as long as every paragraph has clear line of argument, is linked to the question, and has evaluation. You can keep your paragraphs quite short. You don't have to have a massive paragraph. Thank you for that one. How much can you bring in your own opinion? Your own opinion is your line of argument. So you avoid using the term "I think," because that, whilst that's your opinion, you need to argue it in an academic sense. So your whole line of argument. So, for example, I've already said earlier that I'm personally not a fan of situation ethics, but I wouldn't put "I think situation ethics." In an exam, I'd put situation ethics could be seen as questionable, however, because that's then my line of argument. I would then argue why it doesn't work. So your opinion actually comes into it a lot, but you don't put "I think," you put it as your line of argument as to whether you emphasize positive critical words, this is convincing, this is plausible, persuasive, or whether you use negative critical words, this is illogical, questionable, whatever it might be. You pick it based on your opinion. Situation X is the best approach. Thank you for that question there. Do you compare it to another theory, and to what extent do you compare it? If you get a question like situation X is the best approach, or any theory is the best approach, you don't have to bring in another argument. You could just argue whether it is the best or not, just through your simple evaluation. If you do want to bring in another argument, you only bring it in as part of your evaluation of discussion in that paragraph. Do not have a whole paragraph on another theory. It's very, very risky that you then go off on a tangent on another theory. So if it does say situation ethics is the best approach to euthanasia, for example, and then a student starts a paragraph with natural law, I'd be like, why is natural law here? I don't want natural law. I haven't asked for natural law. But if you're doing situation ethics isn't really working, but this little bit of natural law is much better, and it's better because of this, and situation doesn't do this, all in the same paragraph. That's very clever. That's when you would get that nice comparative. So compare always needs to be in the same paragraph, and you need to make it clear why you're putting them together. If you bring in another theory they've not asked for, you have to do it in that way. Otherwise, you might have a massive paragraph that's just not relevant. If it's not relevant, you drop grades. You don't get marked down for putting "I think," no. I just think that you need to set an academic tone. Like at university, you'll rarely use the phrase "I think" at university. It's more of an academic writing to avoid using "I think." So you're still channeling what you think, but the language you use, you can pick much better things. I just always think that "I think" looks very GCSE. It just looks very childish, and I try and at least help my students to write more like degree, where you don't use "I think." You don't use "I think" until you're at PhD level, when you're doing your own research. So I always say you've got to channel your own opinion, but by putting "I think," it just doesn't sound as good as it could do in other ways. But if you do, you won't be marked down, no. How do you show your line of argument without saying "I think"? Again, just like I've said. So, for example, I think that Kant's argument works. I wouldn't put that though. I would say Kant's argument could be seen as persuasive because I'm still channeling what I think. All I've just taken out is the words "I think" at the beginning. So that's the only. So most of the time, when my students write essays, if they put "I think," the rest of the sentence makes complete sense. I just take off the words "I think," and the sentence still makes sense. So think "I think" in my head, but then carry on. I think Kant's argument is persuasive, and that's the bit you write. Relative and absolutist for meta-ethics. Well, relative is your emotivism, absolutist is either ethical naturalism or intuitionism. So that's how you would compare them. What does it mean to say conscience to be a verb? Really good question there, Alex. It's a part of situation, Alex, that I actually think is very, very clever, and you could use it in a conscience as a synoptic linker. But what it means is that most people see conscience like a process, the angel and the devil, the temptation. What should I do? What situation ethics says, or Joseph Fletcher says with conscience is it's a verb, it's a doing word. Conscience is not the thought process, it's actually the act of carrying it out. Conscience is actually the act of carrying out what you think, not just that thought of angel, devil. That's what that means. Oh yeah, no, you won't get Fletcher and conscience. Sorry, I was meaning it for synoptically. That you, if you've got a conscience question, you could bring in a bit of Fletcher, or if you were talking about situation, I think you could bring in a bit of kind of another person's conscience as a synoptic link. Oh no, you absolutely will not get a Fletcher conscience. He's not. You only get Aquinas and Freudian conscience. Sorry to confuse you there. Intuitionism's G more, and there's a couple of others. We again, it's very hard to predict if the grade, but what the grade boundaries will be. It purely depends on how students have performed. So even though the questions were approachable, there's areas where students still may have not done as good as other students. So the grade boundaries probably won't be particularly high. They won't be particularly low. But don't forget as well, your grade boundaries equal out over the three exams anyway. So even if philosophy is maybe more approachable, ethics might be quite challenging, or DCT might be more challenging, or something like that. But it also depends on which topics and arguments you prefer. I come at it from they could have asked a really mean question, but you guys might be coming from it as I hate religious experience and I hate body, mind, and soul, and I hate religious language, so I hate that exam. So I come from the approach to the questions differently to you anyway. But yeah, we won't know about grade boundaries. How do you apply cancer postulates to sex ethics? Well, it will never be asked specifically. So I would say that if you're talking about by the time you've done duty, goodwill, moral law, if you little extra, and you've looked at the different formulations and you've applied different themes in sex, I don't think you'd even have time to talk about the postulates. But if you do, I would say postulates more interweave with the others, that you have free will to do your duty and then you're rewarded afterwards. I don't think the postulates would be a whole separate theme to apply to sex ethics. You could discuss them in a general Kant question and evaluate them, but I think in application to sex, it'd be quite hard to apply them approaches to sex ethics. Act of omissions, very good question, Emma. Um, it's it's act or omission, and that's the law. Passive euthanasia is not giving people what they might need, but that's a willing consent. The act, this is about the legalities of what you do. So act is the actual act of killing somebody. Passive euthanasia is not the act of killing someone. That would be active euthanasia. I guess it would link in with omission, that you're omitting to not give them medical care. So it would go into the omissions part. So you're omitting to give them the medication, but you don't have to legally give them. So you can't. So yes, it would link in quite nicely. Today and tomorrow's revision. Go online and make sure you know something to talk about. See what's going on in the world to do with your sex ethics themes. Um, what else would really help at this point? I think other than just being prepared, look at the past questions on the other PowerPoint to see the wording of them. Could you do them? Could you not do them? What would your line of argument be? Maybe also decide which, on a spectrum, which argument do you think is the most convincing to the least, so that if you get a choice, you know who you talk about. But I would just say focus on whichever other areas that you're just not happy with. Other scholars than Aquinas in natural law. No, not really, because the scholars, you could talk about the Catholic Church and the Catholic Church's application. I think there's a couple of extra names in the criticism. I think Dawkins in there somewhere for criticisms, and I think Barth's in there because Karl Barth argues that you shouldn't use your reason; you should go straight to divine law. So you could add him as an extra name, but it's not necessary. How does Ayer's logical, synthetic, and moral statements link to emotivism? I don't know, Jess. Because that's why he created emotivism to say why it's not analytic or synthetic. So I would say that could link them in quite cleverly synoptically. It's a very good question. You could link them in synoptically to verification to say why he's avoiding the analytics. I think basically he's saying that things that are meaningful are analytic or synthetic. Where do moral statements apply? Well, moral statements are just emotions, so they're only meaningful as a moral emotional statement. That's all the link is there. He's saying that they're not synthetic or analytic because there's no factual basis to them. Oh, when I said moral law, it's just a tiny part of his argument that basically duty, goodwill, and moral law all go together in that it's your duty to follow the moral law with goodwill. It's just about following morality, following the moral law. And it's the moral law within. Basically, you know what you should and shouldn't do. That's what it means. So you should follow your own moral law with goodwill according to your duty. So it's three parts of a triangle that all go together. So the moral law is a very small part of Kant's argument. I just always remember them as being a three together. Some of these questions I've already answered, so just rewatch the video. Oh yes, absolutely. You can definitely criticize the concept of agape within itself. That would be very clever. You can criticize any theory within itself as quite often a good argument to talk about is how the theories work on paper but not in reality. So quite often I find situation ethics wonderful in its idealism, it's a fabulous argument. Applying agape, who wouldn't want to follow that? In reality, it doesn't work. So yes, you could definitely criticize it within itself. That would be clever. The is ought problem is basically is a fact. Somebody is dead, it's a fact. Ought is how you ought to behave, their ethical statements. And basically, it just says no matter how many facts you get, how many is statements you get, you can never say that that ought statement then also becomes a fact. That's probably the easiest summary I can make for that one. How do you know if we've evaluated throughout? You have to have a strong line of argument. And if you've justified that strong line of argument and you've used critical words, then you've argued. Yes, they could ask a specific question on a specific theme, homosexuality, and a specific theory, like Kant. They could do that as well. Yes. So be prepared to be able to talk about. I don't think they would because it'd be quite tricky, but they might do. Depends what they're feeling with ethics. So they could ask. They could be specific and specific. Um, if you get a general question on objective factual basement of metaethics, objective factual means certainly mostly ethical naturalism. Intuitionism comes from a factual base as well, because both are cognitive. So you would need to mention all three. Well, emotivism doesn't believe that it's factual. So emotivism you could use as a criticism against the question, or you could just use ethical naturalism, intuitionism against to say which one's better as far as trying to understand a factual basis. But the factual objective basis of the meaning of language means ethical naturalism and or intuitionism. That's what that question means. For HA Pritchard, just check the teach along because it's all there because there's a couple of other names for the other areas as well. If the question was on, thank you, Scarlett. If the question was on doctrine of double effect, that would be a really tricky question if it was specific. I don't think they would again ask one so specific. If it was, you'd do a paragraph on doctrine of double effect. And how it applies to euthanasia. But then you would say how we understand doctrine of double effect using our reason as a gift from God, how doctrine of double effect could be applied with apparent and real goods, how doctrine of double effect is to hopefully promote the primary precept. So you'd still link, this is for any question. If any question is specific, duty, you still talk about the other areas and how they link to duty. If you get one on Bentham's principle of utility, maximize pleasure, minimize pain, you still talk about the other parts of Bentham. So even if they're specific, you still link the specific into the rest of their argument, because it's the exam board that split them up, whereas the actual philosophers or the ethicists write about them as a whole. Kant doesn't say this is a paragraph on duty and this is now a paragraph of goodwill. Kant merges his arguments in his book. So the examiner's the one that separate them. So you can still merge them in an essay as long as you make it clear how it links to what they're asking for in the question. Well, they're not going to ask one about communism, Maria, in business ethics because it's not specified. They might ask about capitalism, and therefore you can talk about communism if you want to. Depends on the question. If the question is specific on capitalism, then you could talk about Marx, but you would do that synoptically from the bits you've learned, maybe from liberation theology. But you wouldn't have to go into capitalism. Just means about making money. Let's make it so that we can make as much money as possible. So I would still link it more to kind of the Alan Sugar of, you know, the focus of good business is to make money, or the focus of Friedman of how and whether capitalism as a drive for businesses makes it good, and therefore like the drive of capitalism for Apple meant that they didn't pay their workers enough, so they had high bouts of suicide. So I wouldn't go down a massive, unless you're very confident with Marx, then you could bring in Marxism. But there's many of you that aren't confident with Marxism, and therefore you could still do capitalism without going into great depth about those other areas, unless you are confident and comfortable. Always pick two contrasting ones. So I would avoid doing all four theories if possible. Always pick two that contrast for depth and evaluation. There is one area that you could get a specific question on capitalism. I can't think what the wording of the question is specifically. Again, it'll be on the predictions PowerPoint. There is one question they might ask you that's specific to that area. In sexual ethics, do you just compare the Church of England to Catholic views? Depends what the question is, and don't forget you can bring in any of your ethical theories. So you need to be able to link in Kant, natural law, utilitarianism, etc. So sex ethics isn't just about Christian approaches; it would be about all your theories, unless it specifies religious approaches to sex ethics. But then natural law is a religious approach. Kantian still has some religious parts. John Stuart Mill still talks about how links in his argument links to the golden rule. So a lot of situations started out as religious, as Christian, and then so if it asks for religious views, you could do Church of England and Catholic, but it's more about the application of the theories from the first year, and the parts of you could link in the parts from them that are religious, but that would work if it's relevant for the question. I'd be very careful if it asks for specifically Kant and homosexuality, bringing in another one of the theories, bringing in another a theme. So talking about premarital or extramarital sex, because if you really make it clear to the examiner why it's relevant to the question, then potentially how it reads, if I've read it from a student, is you've run out of things to say about homosexuality, so you're now trying to crowbar in something else, because you don't have enough to say about homosexuality. That's how most of the time it comes across and reads. So I would say if you can just talk about Kant and homosexuality and know two or three things, look at them up tonight, find two or three things you could talk about for homosexuality. That would be enough to talk about in an essay, a case study, a law, and a statistic, something like that. That would get you through. I would say avoid linking in, even if Kant is better at another theory. You can do it because it's good evaluation, but make sure it doesn't read like, I don't know what else to write, so I'm adding it in and hoping for the best. The Catholic Church is significantly influenced by natural law. So the Catholic Church is very influenced by natural law. So there are differences because Catholic Church has many of its own teachings, but they significantly overlap because they got a lot of inspiration from natural law, like the views of the precepts, like the views on marriage, celibacy for the people higher up, etc. Right, folks, we've only got a few minutes left. Susie, just check out the teach along for Bradley. That'll be the easiest way to cover Bradley. I don't know what that means, Max. What ethical theory do I like the most? But it would be a mock-up as far as arguing it. It would be a mock-up between Kant and natural law. I don't like the solutions that natural law leads to, but as far as applying natural law, I think natural law is very, very clever though in that it to say it was written so long ago, the precepts still stand. Well, certainly the first four still stand that you should preserve life, and that if we didn't reproduce, yes, it's not right for everybody, but if we didn't reproduce, the human race would die out. That we do want to promote an order society, we do want to educate young minds. So, and I really like Aquinas's ideas of explaining why people still get things wrong. So, for an ethical theory, I think natural law works quite well, even though I don't like the outcomes of what it means to apply it. So, for example, reproduction is against homosexuality. They don't like the solution. I don't like the outcome, but I like the process. But I would say that the ethical theory I like the most is virtue ethics, which is Aristotle's. You don't learn that anymore. It was on the old spec. Virtue ethics is fabulous. Aristotle's ethics is significantly better than his philosophy. The Aristotelian ethics are just wonderful. Virtue ethics, I think, is very, very good. So it's a shame you guys don't have to learn it because I think that's one of the best arguments. What's most likely to come up? It's on the Saffron. It's on the predictions PowerPoint. There's actually a predictions PowerPoint with slides with the questions I think are most likely. And basically, it's just the areas that are just the really obvious gaps. It's very hard to predict ethics because there's so many possible overlaps in that they could ask a sex, but they could ask it from any other theory. So it's very hard to predict specifically. But the I just highlight the gaps. So, like I said, situation ethics has never been asked. Kant's never been asked specifically for sex ethics. Guilt's never been asked in conscience. Ethical naturalism's never been asked in meta ethics. So there's obvious gaps. Utilitarianism's never been asked in the second year on its own. So that's they're not really predictions. It's more me just showing you what gaps there are. Best essay structure, it purely depends on what the question is. Globalization, watch the beginning of this stream because I went through it. Yeah, globalization, I went over it at the beginning, so just what I've gone through that specifically, so just watch the beginning part. Right, folks, any last few questions? Because my brain is fried now. Fried brain. The teacher log, do you mean the teacher blog? It's just under the same name as what my YouTube's under, so just Google that and it'll come up. Annabeth, you will be fine. You do know it. So for everyone, do not panic. You've got this. You've got ethics. You've been learning this for 2 years. Do not panic about tomorrow's exam. Once you see those questions, it will come with God's will. The answers will flow through you. And if nothing else, just try and put something that's relevant to the question and just try and argue something. If all else fails, just argue something because you will get some marks at least for that. So you have got this, everyone, though. You really have. DCT next week might be a different question because I know students really don't like those topics. Even though I think they're some of them are really good. So yeah, no, you have got this, everyone. You really have. You can argue natural law is outdated. It just seems a little bit of it seems like an easy criticism. It's like 2000, well, not 2000 years old, that was Jesus, but it's like 1,000 years old. So of course it's outdated. But so you could argue that, but then so are many things. Many things, most of our laws that we have in this country, therefore, are outdated if you're going by it was written this long ago. So I would more say how the principles of it still apply, but how the outcome, like I said, of homosexuality not it would be natural law would be against in most cases homosexuality, certainly for reproduction. that actually that answer doesn't work with how we approach things in society now. So you could definitely talk about that, how the theory and the application actually works, but the outcome doesn't work in reality for our society that has moved forward. That would work nicer than just going with the outdated argument. Yeah, brilliant. Two highly evaluated paragraphs, backwards and forwards. Great. If you can go into three paragraphs, don't forget the less paragraphs, separate paragraphs don't have massive paragraphs, but certainly the back and forth, brilliant. Um, Honor, thank you for your question. I would keep an eye on your timings very closely. I think conclusions are extremely important. It's the bookends of your essay. You have an introduction that's very brief, you have a conclusion that's brief. You need to finish your essay off properly. Even if you're running out of time and you have 30 seconds left, even 10 seconds, just quickly write. In conclusion, therefore, the argument does not work. Even those 7 words or however many words there are, that's a conclusion. So I would say, above all else, try and get a conclusion in, because you need to finish off your essays. It's like a book without an ending. Yeah, it's all right if you do two very long for and against. It just is sometimes hard for your examiner to follow your line of argument. If the paragraph is really long, the paragraphs actually help you understand what it is that you're arguing. But if you do two long ones backwards and forwards, that's fine. Ah. How do you secure AO2 max? Critical words, line of argument. I think euthanasia will come on for situation ethics if it's going to be there. Conscience, I'm not. I think meta ethics is more likely than conscience. Yeah, if the question's on sex ethics general and no theory, you could do all three themes. That's fine. You could split it up to do with your three homosexuality themes. Critical words, critical words is what I call things like logical, persuasive, illogical, questionable, words that add a level of criticism, whether it's positive or negative, what you're talking about. So if you said that person's wearing a cardigan, that's a fact. That person's wearing a nice cardigan, the word nice is a critical word. You're actually adding your opinion in as to you showing, oh, I like that cardigan. So the critical word is the word that somebody could always disagree with you on. Someone might go, that cardigan's flipping awful. Awful's then the critical word there as well. So the critical words are what separates something from just being a fact into being evaluative. AO1 is kind of just explaining. You've got AO1 is your names, it's your quotes, your book titles, it is your content, so it is your explanation. So that is your AO1. Yeah, predictions, they're on YouTube, so they're on a video there. If you get a specific question on ethical naturalism, I'd compare it with one other theory rather than both. I'd compare it with a theory you think's better or worse, just for depth of detail. You could do all three, but if it's specific on ethical naturalism, be very clear. Ethical naturalism is your vein throughout. That if you do mention another theory, it is only in relation to what they've asked you in the question. Yeah, no, Sam, that's a very good question. AO2 is where your marks are. AO2, your evaluation. You will still get extremely good marks and probably more marks than if you just know a bit of AO1, but it's all about the evaluation. That gets you very good marks. If you know tons of content but little evaluation, you will struggle. Whereas actually knowing more evaluation or being able to argue something more, even maybe not having as much content, you actually will do better. Yes, that's what they want. They want evaluation. Yeah, I would theme it on based on Kant's arguments. Yes, Millie. So I would theme it based on Kant's ideas. So I would do duty. Universalizability. Don't forget as well, everyone, that there's 4 examples given by Kant for universalizability. Neglecting one's talents, suicide, refraining from helping others, and lying promise. You might be able to apply them very nicely across as well. So, for example, lying promise works very nicely for Kant and extramarital sex, for example, or suicide, find suicide rates within the homosexual community and things like that. So, so yes, I would, again, with the question, whatever comes first in the question is the structure of your essay. So it's Kant and sex, then Kant is your structure. If it's sex theories, then sex is what you would structure it as. Why does Kant say homosexuality can't be universalized? Well, he doesn't, for a start. But his theory of universalizability means if everyone did this universally, what would happen? If something bad would happen, then you can't do it. So it's the idea that if you apply universalizability and everybody became homosexual, well, the human race would die because nobody would procreate. So it's the idea that the universalizability, homosexuality can't be universalized. But all Kant could argue, or what you could argue, is applying Kant's theory is you just make the maxim, the general rule, smaller. So rather than everybody becomes homosexual, it's if everyone that wants to be homosexual is, then actually that would be fine. If everyone that wants to be a homosexual was a homosexual, nothing wrong would happen in the world, because then you still have heterosexual people that were able to procreate to continue the human race. So if you universalize everyone doing it, then we'd have problems. If you just universalize the people that wanted to be homosexual were homosexual, that's absolutely fine. Nothing would, nothing, Kant would not be against that. Case studies for business ethics, very good. Yes, definitely. I think they're very, very helpful when in part of your discussion. And the same for euthanasia and some for sex ethics. So you might need to research some for sex ethics tonight. Oh yes, fallible. Use that in ethics as well. Fabulous word. Yep, use that. How can you evaluate business ethics? Again, that's your judgment, whether you think businesses are ethical or not, whether you think Kant's theory is useful when applied to business. That again, your evaluation is your line of argument, how you see the things. Oh, right. I think I am done, folks. If you do have any other questions, just comment on the videos tonight, and I will try and respond to them. I am going to go and hunt my cat down, who is somewhere in the garden and probably freezing under a table somewhere. And I'm going to go and get on with my tea. So good luck, everybody, tomorrow in your exam in the afternoon. Again, I can answer questions in the morning. If you've got questions, just post them on YouTube. Otherwise, thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate you joining me once more, and I hope you found this session useful. So yeah, continue with some good revision. Good luck tomorrow, and I'll be thinking about you all. Bye, everyone.